The darkness had returned with a thick acidic stench that clung to Kallan's skin. The red smoke wafted from the bowl with its bitter tang. Kallan tried to stand, to fight, to run, but the chains of Elding had her bound. She could not move or open her mouth to scream. There was only night, the shadows, and darkness. Blaine stood over her, staring down from the black that filled all the white of his eyes. Behind him, donned in the leather overcoat, Ori watched, unmoving and indifferent as Blaine drew back his foot. His kick landed against the side of her head, and Kallan woke. Crimson willow greeted her with a scent of grouse sizzling over the fire instead of the bitter taste. Her stomach churned for want of food. She tried to stand, but found herself still weighted down. She glowered with vile contempt at Ori's coat covering her body, and with great force angrily flung it away as if it had been a blanket crawling with spiders. Above, the sun spilled its late morning light onto her like a warm yellow blanket that filled the cloudless sky. Without a word, she ran her hand over her face and battled back the nightmare with a slew of silent curses to Mara. "Good morning," Rune said as he flipped the skewers on the fire. "I felt it best to let you sleep." Firing off a miserable frown at her warden, Kallan rose to her feet. Her hair tumbled past her waist, and she fumbled her way to the fire in the oversized tunic that slid off a shoulder. The pants, which she had tightened with a strip of twine, added a distinct frumpy look to her morning muddle, and seemed to evoke a smile from Rune, who kept his face low as if trying to obscure her view. Tucking her knees to her chest, Kallan crouched beside the fire as Rune nudged at the charred wood beneath four skewered grouse breasts propped beside the flame. The day was sickeningly happy and night bright, the exact contradiction of her mood. Birds twittered as Kallan flashed a gaze to Astrid, who grazed peacefully at the river. Rome promptly passed her a helping of grouse while she twitched nervously at each critter hidden away in the surrounding forest. Kallan ate in silence, unable to ignore Rune's scrutiny. She was all too aware of the tension. Her breath remained steady, her fingers curled with unease, and her back was forever taut as if ready for battle. Once she finished her second helping, she picked the ashes with a skewer that surrendered the empty stick to the flame and reached a hand behind her. Blindly she fished for the woolen blanket she had used as a bed the night before, and pulled it over her shoulders against the absent chill and the thick warmth. With a muffled thump, her dagger struck the ground. Kallan widened her eyes as she stared at the sleek, slender sheen of blood-ton in the grass. She raised her eyes to Rune while the dagger lay unclaimed. Sunlight glistened off the blade as Kallan wondered when he had taken it. She turned her attention back to Bloodton. "I found you," Rune said. "I've healed you. I've fed you. I've guarded you. For 3 nights you've slept beside me." Kallan blushed red with embarrassment. "If I sought to kill you, I would have let the Dvagar do it for me," Rune said. Blood rushed from Kallan's face, leaving her skin an unnatural white as Nordri's words came rushing back. "Truth is, if we were going to kill you, we wouldn't have waited until now to do it, and we wouldn't have used poison." "I wouldn't have waited for you to annoy me," Rune said, and Kallan knew he saw the sudden tremor in her hand and the increase of her breath at the mere mention of the Dvagar. "Or tolerate you kicking me in my—" He stopped there. Kallan stared at the blade and waited for Rune to swipe Bloodthorn back. Slowly, she reached out and took up the Elding hilt. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her back stiff with tension. "Tell me where the Dvagar took you." Rune's words bit the air. More than eagerness audibly snipped his tone. Kallan waited until she had finished securing the dagger at her waist before answering. "They said they wanted my pouch," Kallan said. "Did they say why?" Rune asked. She noted the urgency in his voice that had picked up again. She bit her bottom lip and shook her head. "Most of the time they spoke to Dvagar," she said. Rune glanced at her hand, still holding the dagger's hilt, and a long silence settled between them. "Why would they want a pouch?" he said. Kallan looked at Astrid grazing along the river before turning back to Rune. "There are spells and enchantments associated with the Sukona's pouch, as unique as the Sukona carrying it." "What spells lay dormant within that pouch?" he asked. Kallan tensed, and he was on to the next question. "Why did they kill you once they knew you didn't have it?" he asked. Kallan shrugged. "I don't know." "Who's Ori?" Kallan sharpened her alertness. Her knuckles were right on the hilt. "You talk in your sleep," Rune said. "Who is he?" Kallan shrugged again, passing off an urge to wield her scythe and pull her dagger on him. The fire tickled the air. Pursing her lips, she gulped. "He was one of them," she said, knowing her answer left Rune with a distinct feeling that there was more to the story than she told. "There was one in a cave," Rune said, "dead, from the looks of it. A Sukona had stormed the place with all the ash, fire, and brimstone that forms in Muspelheim." A sudden sick settled, making Kallan regret eating her fill of grouse. "How did you get free?" Rune asked, not giving her the chance to deny she had. Kallan shook her head and pressed her mouth to her knees. "When I woke, my chains were gone," she said, lifting her head and keeping her eyes on the fire. "Why did Monsignor kill your mother?" Rune asked. Calm caution drained from Kallan's face. We were at war, she said. I was 6. I know very little. A shadow fell over Rune, no longer masked and passive in attentiveness. I am my father's heir, he said. I was trained and groomed to inherit the kingdom my father left to me. I do not doubt your father did the same for you. He would not have hoarded Lorlenalin's secrets, not from his heir. Kallan gave a small pshaw, abandoning her pleasantries. At last she released the dagger's handle and pulled the blanket closer, hugging her legs tighter into her chest. And do you think I would hand them over to you so freely? She asked. Rune narrowed his eyes. Who honed your side skills? Gudrun. Kallan was already snipping. Who taught you the sword? He asked. Kallan's hand shook against her legs. She didn't answer. I've seen you in battle, Rune said. I know a skilled swordsman when I see it. Who taught you? Dagon. She released the name reluctantly. Flames between them flicked their tips, whipping the air as the wind carried them. The Dokafar you charged with diplomatic exchanges with Gunir. Who was he? Rune asked. Kallan's knuckles were white, numbed from the death grip she had on her legs. She felt her cooperation waning. Eric. What station does he hold in your court? He said. Kallan remained tight-lipped. Indulge me, he said. Let's assume for one moment that I did send a letter requesting peace. If I were to send such a letter, who would see to it that it reached your hands? Rune asked. My High Marshal, Kallan answered between her teeth. Who is? Why do you ask so much? How did your father die? Kallan's eyes widened with memory. She parted her lips. Fear and madness swelled behind her eyes. Months passed before I stopped seeing his blood on my hands, Kallan said. What did you see? Rune said. You should know! You were there! Rune released a long sigh. You've managed to expand the list of your patients with vague answers and half-lies. What did you see? A guttural cry rolled from Kallan's throat. Through the black he was stabbed! Through the back without sword or honor! That, she spat, is what I saw! Rune drew a deep breath. On the day that you fought at the Dokafar post, Rune asked, who rode with you? Whose face did you see as your father lay dying at your feet? Enough! Kallan said, punching the ground. The fight had left her. The color drained from her face, and his words ripped down her wall. With choreographed precision, Kallan stood and stomped to Astrid. After snatching the reins, she hoisted herself into the saddle and sent Astrid trotting along the river's edge. In the light, Kallan's eyes were clear and vibrant, responding to each shade and hue, which reassured Rune that the drug had finally passed through her system. Her complexion, no longer grayed with the decay of malnourishment and abuse, radiated beneath the sun. Rune stared after her, annoyed at her sudden flight. He'd pushed her beyond the line of tolerance, risking her rage, but timing was everything. If he jumped too soon, he would lose her. A part of him knew she was not ready, but he had flouted an air of indifference and played his part too well. As long as she evaded, he would not get his answers. As long as she brooded, denying the abuse she had endured from the Devagar, as long as she harbored her hatred and avoided the true core to her rage, she would not trust him to speak. If she insisted on bearing her grief with avoidance, then anger would be just the thing to force the grief to the surface. Her anger just might save her yet. And at long last, Rune knew what he would have to do. Uneven tundra sliced Astrid's hooves, forcing Kallan to dismount almost immediately while the camp was still in view. Kallan crossed her arms over her chest and watched as her warden stood, stretched, belched, and aimlessly strolled about the camp, collecting their possessions, extinguishing the fire at his leisure. After a long 10 minutes and a longer trip into the forest to relieve himself, Rune swaggered along the bank to Kallan. The sunlight caught the fire opal poised at the end of the hilt as he sauntered, holding the sword steady at his side. You forgot this, princess, he said, dumping the overcoat into her chest, considerably rougher than needed, and holding it where she could shrug him off or drop the coat. Don't call me that, she said, and I don't want it. You mistake me for someone who cares, Rune said, releasing the coat onto Kallan. Keep it or freeze, princess. With a cold shoulder, he tied the bags to the saddle. You could always bunk with me at night. An egotistical grin pulled the corner of his mouth taut, and Kallan seethed while holding back a stream of save. Their slow start cost them half a day's light spent at the bank of the river, until the water veered east. Required to abandon their water supply and reliable fish stock for the journey north, Rune caught as much salmon as they could carry and refilled the bladders he found in Ori's pack. The cold, harsh winds whipped mercilessly across the frozen plains, slicing their exposed skin. Grouse were abundant among the crimson carpet, the burnt browns and mild mustards of the tundra grass. The change in the landscape was welcomed and allowed them to increase their pace, but only slightly. They finished the last of the purple saxifrage, nibbling it as they walked, and much to Kallan's delight replaced it with the occasional batch of cloudberries where they could get them. By late afternoon a deep thunder moved in, not from the clouds, but the barren plains ahead. Reindeer, no fewer than 800, speckled the land, blended with the white tufts of cotton grass. Their endless barks and grunts mingled with the constant clicks of their knees, and close in the region in a deafening collection of sounds that mingled with the steady pound of their hooves. Forced to keep their distance from the danger of the rut, the Alpha watched from afar, stunned at the occasional skirmish between bulls. Nearly an hour had passed before the herd had moved on like a flowing river of brown and white through the valley. The once frequent white stones dwindled with the increase of trees as the sporadic clusters of birch continued to pepper the horizon. They moved through the trees, pushing past smaller rocks and thick, abundant mosses that pleasantly cushioned their feet. The sun threw oranges and reds across the sky, casting a golden glow overhead. As they walked, dusk added shadows of purple and blue to the landscape until the last of the day's light vanished behind the mountains. Beneath the barely waning moon, they walked until they stood at the brink of open ground cradled between far-reaching mountains on either side. Rune was the first to stop, his gaze fixed on the distance through the darkness where the fire's light beckoned to them like a beacon. "What's wrong?" Kallan asked. "Stay back," Rune said as he moved into a large cluster of shrubs. From behind the foliage, he looked to where the base of 3 mountains joined into a single valley. The path they had followed into the north cut through the valley before them. Like a grand basin of green, the land expanded to the west and the east, continuing through the base of the mountains. There, the land leveled out, reaching like a hand that invited them. Rune kept his voice unusually low. "Years ago, this was a route used by the merchants and traders. The glade was vacant then, with a single farm tucked to the corner of the valley." Kallan said nothing as she peered through the valley of which he spoke. The spacious glen was gone, filled instead with an endless number of tents crammed into every opening as far as they could see. A myriad of campfires filled the valley in light, and in their midst, mingled with mead, laughter, and song, a king's army sat exchanging swords, swapping food, and hoarding drink. Their numbers exceeded well over 10,000. They had scattered their armaments about, leaning spears against tents, and splayed out bows and swords on dried hides, carved into shields, molded into the hilts of their sword, and painted haphazardly onto tunics and tents was a thin, sickly rune painted red on white. Behind him, the warmth of Kallan's breath grazed his neck. "I told you to stay back," Rune said in a hushed whisper. Her face was inches from his. "No," she whispered, eyeing each rune emblazoned by the fire's light. "They need help." "That is not enough," Rune said, looking back to the camp. "But it is. They've written it there," Kallan pointed. "Nov means need. We must help them." Kallan pushed herself past Rune, who managed to grab her by the wrist before she plowed onto the encampment. He pulled her back harder than expected. She fell back into him. "They do not need help," he whispered. "That is not the rune of our kin, nor are they born of this land." "Then their mark is of Asgard, and that is Mjolnir," Kallan argued, pointing to the nearest soldier whose shield bore the mark. "They must be riders of Thor." "No," Rune said, shaking his head. "That is no hammer." Kallan looked through the shrubs that hid them, clearly not entirely sure of the problems that presented itself. "That is the valley we need to cross if we are to continue this trail north," Rune said. "So we'll go around," Kallan said, determined to not linger over such petty things. "We are surrounded," Rune said. "To the west, cliffs plunge to the sea. They are impassable without a ship. To the east, the mountains climb as high as Jotunheim." "We'll go south then, back toward Viken," she said. "Where the Dvagar hunt you?" Rune asked. "Our only path is here, away from the mountains and the cliffs that fall to the sea." Kallan studied the nearest tent. "Then we go on," she said, and with her bind apparently made up, she gave Rune a shove and tightened her grip on Astrid's reins. "Be still, woman," Rune said. "We can't sit still, and we can't go back," she whispered. "Do you see how many there are? There are thousands!" Rune shook his head and looked back to the tents. "We'll wait. By morning they should be gone, and then we can—" "Kallan!" Kallan stepped from the cover of the brush, leading Astrid into the camp, as Gudrun's words merged to the forefront of her thoughts. "The race of men is different. Like the Liosafa, they know nothing of the shade that flows through the land. Their women, sickly and weak, are nothing at all like the slender grass of the Alfar, whose long, hard torsos, tapered ears, and strength match the gods. There are those who will stop at nothing to look upon the grace of the Alfar, even those who would seek to take one as their own." The first of the soldiers froze, captivated by the sheer wonder of the Alfar. Standing just a head higher than most, her skin as luminescent and as pure as moonlight, radiated with a permanent youth that did not fade. Her eyes glowed clear with a brilliance unparalleled by any beauty beheld by the race of man. Rune came to stand behind Kallan with a look like he was holding in a lecture. Passing like a stifled breeze through the camp, Kallan, Rune, and Astrid walked on without a word. Silence followed them as they moved, taking with them a trail of bystanders. Soldiers dropped swords, lowered drinks, and stilled their tongues, all for a chance to gape at the Alfheim. Most had heard the legends that tradesmen and raiders carried to the islands in the west. With awe they gathered, eager to steal a single look from the woman's eye. They moved as if in a dream. Some pondered which side of asleep they were on. Though the Alpha heard the clang of dropped swords, followed by the murmurs of onlookers, they saw only their end. The tents dispersed, and the light from the camps grew dim as the crowd behind them grew. When the darkest black of the distant road was in sight, Rune dared to take his eyes from the goal and glanced at Kallan, who seemed entirely indifferent to the danger. With her head high, she displayed her regality through her confidence. Her stupid, arrogant confidence, Rune mused. Bergen will laugh himself mad over this. The tents finally vanished, and the Alpha returned to the sanctuary of the forest, slipping into the darkness like white wraiths whose corporeal presence had materialized before human eyes for a moment's breath. At the edge of the forest, eager for a second glimpse of the female, a group of soldiers peered into the shadows where the enthralling mystic had vanished with her horse and guardian. Among them, unable to ignore the diminishing doubt, Thord focused his stare on the Dolkafar. "Follow them,"